And welcome to Riverside Episcopal Church. Our podcast each and every week is where faith, community, and everyday life intertwine. We believe in being guided by God's Word and embracing every heart. You're invited to join us each and every Sunday at 10 a.m., and you can find more about us at riversidemcalla.org. So we want to bring you this week's sermon from Reverend Cameron Nations.
You don't have to follow along in your Bibles, actually, but if you want to, you are welcome to. We're going to turn to Matthew chapter 13, where our gospel reading is found. And in these Bibles, that would be at the very, very bottom of page, well, it's page 13, but of the New Testament. So it starts over again at 0, apparently, in these Bibles. I know, yeah. Not the actual page 13, but the second page 13. That's right. So why I want us to look at this in the Bible this morning is twofold. One, I want to talk about parables in general, okay, as a genre, and why Jesus talks in them, teaches in them, why Jesus used parables. But I also want us to be looking at the chapter in the Bible because if you look at your bulletin, you will notice something, that in the reference for today's gospel reading, there are some chunks missing. Now, y'all may remember that we get our readings every Sunday from something called the Revised Common Lectionary. I don't come up with it. We don't choose it. It's something that the church, not just the Episcopal Church, but also other denominations, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, all use, well, and Catholics actually, also use the Revised Common Lectionary. And so these readings are appointed. And I'm always very curious when I see the appointed readings for Sunday, and it's clear that we've skipped over some stuff. It's like, what is that stuff that we're skipping over? Why are we skipping over it? Now, sometimes you're skipping over it because it's kind of salacious or something. It's like the lectionary people were like, well, we might not want to have the preachers talk about that. And so you sort of skip over it. Today, it's not like that. It's actually just to kind of make it a little cleaner. You've got the parable of the sower, then Jesus's interpretation. But we're missing some context in between. And what makes this parable, the parable of the sower, so interesting and important is it's one of the only parables that Jesus explains. The other one of which is also in Matthew 13, and that's why we'll look at that today. But before we dive into Matthew and these two parables that we'll discuss, I want to talk a bit about what a parable even is. Is anyone wanting to venture a guess at how you might define what a parable is? What's a parable? Yeah, y'all didn't think we were really going to do Bible study, but we are. We are. Really. A story, a metaphor. Metaphor is a little closer. Yeah, so a parable is sort of like a simile or a metaphor in that it is a comparison between two things. The word parable literally means something thrown alongside something else. So think about what is something that's in parallel to something else, right? Para, meaning alongside. And then the bull part of parable comes from the Greek verb ballo, which means to throw, and it's where we get our word ball, right? It's something that's thrown. I know. See, we're learning some stuff today. So a parable is literally something thrown alongside something else. And Jesus didn't invent parables, but though he does use them often, right, in his teachings. Parables were an ancient form of Jewish teaching. It's like part of his toolbox, basically. It was one of the things that he had to pull from. We do have some examples, even in the Old Testament, of parables, so there's not very many. But so when Jesus teaches in parables, he's not just like making them up out of nowhere. It would have been something that people would be familiar with, that rabbis used parables to teach. Now, some of you said a parable is a story, and that's true. It is a story. But unlike using a story for other illustration purposes, like let's say I wanted to make a point in my sermon, and in order to do that, I tell you a story about, I want to make a point about generosity, and so I tell a story about generosity. Parables aren't exactly like that. In that, parables don't necessarily illustrate. In fact, they create tension and friction that you try to resolve. And that's part of what makes parables really fun. So, for instance, let's look at Matthew chapter 13. If we look a little bit further down, okay, in Matthew 13, starting at verse 31, we find another of Jesus's very famous parables, which is the parable of the mustard seed. You'll see that on the next page, which would be page 14 in this Bible. The parable of the mustard seed. And what is Jesus doing here? He says, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he goes on to tell the story. And that is how a parable works. Is you take something, a lot of Jesus's parables are about the kingdom of heaven, right? So let's just say we take the kingdom of heaven, and then instead of simply saying the kingdom of heaven is a place where everyone is happy, or something like that. Well, that's not very interesting. What does that mean? Well, we all know. Well, okay, we know what it means to be happy. The kingdom of heaven is a place where everybody's happy. That's not what Jesus does, though. Instead of saying the kingdom of heaven is, and then something kind of concrete we can all attach ourselves to, he tells the story about a mustard seed. And you're left going, what does that have to do with anything, Jesus, right? Like, it's that friction in between the thing and the story that makes a parable really, really fascinating. It's in that friction, the two things thrown alongside one another. And so what do parables do? Well, parables, by their very nature, invite exploration, right? They invite exploration. They make you ask, how is this thing like that thing? How is the kingdom of heaven like a mustard seed? How do these details in this story relate somehow to the thing being described? How can we understand maybe various characters within the narrative or different things that are happening? And what is the symbolic importance of these things? And how do they each maybe pull out some deeper meaning and thread to help us get at what this thing, the kingdom of heaven, is really and truly like? Now, I've used this quote maybe before, even in a sermon here, and I never should use it because every time I use it, I say, I can't remember if this is exactly right or where it even comes from. But I believe Barbara Brown Taylor has said about parables that they are stories that are big enough for you to enter into them and walk around inside of them. They have room for you to walk around inside. And I love that image because that is what a parable does. They're roomy sort of stories. They have space for us to explore and wonder and search and seek, right? And so, most of the time when Jesus tells a parable, that's what we are left to do, to wonder, to question, to scratch our heads and say, okay, Jesus, who's this character in the story? Who's this character? Is this character God? Is this character you? Are they us? You know, all of that sort of stuff. Except today we get two parables in Matthew 13 where Jesus gives us the answer key, which I think is very interesting. So let's look at that to get at the question of why Jesus might teach in parables. The disciples asked Jesus this very question, not just kind of here in Matthew 13, but also in Mark. And in Mark's gospel, when they asked Jesus why he teaches in parables, Jesus' response is essentially like, well, because they're hard, actually. They're deeply mysterious, so that's why I teach in them, and you probably I teach in them so you won't really know what I'm talking about. And it's like, well, thank you, Jesus. That's very cool. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Now I have my own theory about why Jesus teaches in parables. We'll get to it in a minute, but something similar happens here. So at the beginning of 13, we get the parable of the sower. It says that same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. And there's great crowds that are assembled around, and Jesus tells them many things in parables, okay? Not all of them we get here, but he tells them many things in parables, and including this one, the parable of the sower, which I won't recount for you because we just heard it read to us. And then, here, starting at verse 10, then the disciples came and asked him, why do you speak to them in parables? This is a good question, right? Why are we teaching in parables? And Jesus answers, well, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not yet been given. For to those who have more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The reason I speak to them in parables is that, quote, seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they will not listen, nor do they understand, end quote. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen, but never understand. You will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, Jesus says, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So see, this is the part that we missed in today's gospel reading. This was the part that was cut out. How many of you feel like it helps you understand better why Jesus teaches in parables? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. If you don't, that would be fair too, because I think it still raises some questions. Like, what is this about? Like, why be so obfuscating, Jesus? You know, if the point is genuinely to teach, what is the point of teaching? Understanding, comprehension, right? I mean, if you go and were to take a class on something and you come out of the class not understanding any of the material, you would probably wonder, was this teacher very effective, right? And so I think it is fair that the disciples are asking this question. And it's also fair, I think, to wonder from Jesus's response, what's really going on? If universal comprehension isn't the aim here, which it seems like it's not, though maybe it is, what is the point of preaching and teaching in parables? And what is this business of having ears that hear, eyes that see, and some do and some don't? How do we understand this? Well, I guess because in some sense comprehension is important, at least for the disciples, Jesus gives the answer key to the parable of the sower, right, which we did hear read this morning. He says, hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown. This is what was sown on the path, right? And then he goes on to explain the rocky soil, the thorns, all the stuff, right? This is how we understand this parable. So then, after he explains this parable, Jesus puts before them another parable, it says in verse 24. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? And he answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Well, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Okay, so he tells this parable, and then we get the mustard seed, and he tells the parable of the yeast, and then finally we get verse 34. Jesus told the crowds all of these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, that I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. So this is at least Matthew's idea of why Jesus is speaking in parables, is because the Messiah is supposed to, right? And so this is how Matthew's understanding this. And then Jesus explains the parable of the weeds. So there's this weird interpolation thing going where Jesus is telling a parable and we don't get the answer key till later. So then it says in verse 36, Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him saying, Well, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Apparently they're still not catching on, right? They want to know, like, well, okay, what's the answer to this one? How do we understand this? And Jesus says, The one who sows the good seeds is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are his children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect all the kingdom, all the causes of sin, and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. Let anyone with ears listen. It's like, I think if I was the disciples, I'd be like, I'm not sure I wanted to know the answer to the parable, Jesus. Now, there is a lot that we could do in talking about the content of both of these parables, of Jesus's explanations and what they mean and all of that sort of stuff. And it would be a super enriching conversation because exploring the parables always is. But as I mentioned, today I didn't want to talk so much about the content of both parables and what sort of doctrine or theology we can gain from them, as I wanted to talk about why parables? Why parables? As the disciples wonder, why parables? Now, I want to answer that question in conclusion this morning with a few different things that do relate to the parable of the sower. The first reason I think why parables is because Jesus is talking about things that cannot be adequately explained due to the limits of human language. I don't think that human language can adequately explain the kingdom of heaven, which is why Jesus can't talk about it without talking in parables. I don't think that he can physically do it. Because think about it, every time you describe something, you draw a boundary around it, don't you? And actually, that's a good thing in many ways, because that's how we have clarity and understanding amongst one another. Like if I talk about that chair, and I talk about that chair is green and it has a metal structure to it and all that sort of stuff, it helps me to describe the chair because it limits what that chair can be and how you understand it. Does that make sense? It's part of why actually there's ancient wisdom in the Jewish practice of not naming God. Are y'all familiar with this? That you wouldn't name God because to name God is actually to limit God, right? And so you wouldn't speak the name of God, for instance. You may give God certain characteristics or attributes. We actually talked about that a few weeks ago from Genesis when we hear the story of Hagar, and Hagar gives God a name, the God who sees. You may do something like that in naming God, like God who provides or God who sees or God, something like that. But there's a reason why when Moses goes to the burning bush and asks the burning bush, well, who should I tell these people that you are? God's response is, I am that I am, right? I am being itself. You can't actually describe me. And I think there's something like that going on with Jesus's use of parables. Part of why he teaches in parables about the kingdom of heaven is because to even try to describe the kingdom of heaven in earthly language would be not to describe it at all, because our language would limit it so much. And so Jesus talks in parables because they are actually hard to understand and they require exploration. Some of the parables, actually, you really do wish Jesus would have given an answer key to, because you're like, what's happening in here? The parable I think of in particular is it's the parable of the dishonest steward, right? Where there's the main character of the parable is this steward who writes off everybody's debts, and then the Lord of the manor finds out about it, but instead of getting him in trouble, he praises him for his use of dishonest wealth. And you're like, what does this mean? How do we, I think we're meant to wrestle. We're meant to wrestle. It's not meant to be easy because we're dealing with things that are infinitely mysterious, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus teaches in parables. The second reason is kind of like unto it, which is that Jesus teaches in parables because Jesus desires relationship. God has always been about relationship. And one of the things that is necessary for relationship is exploration and curiosity, right? That's how we get to know one another, is by asking questions and wondering and all of that sort of thing, right? If you have a relationship with somebody that's very flat and one-dimensional, they never surprise you, they don't, right? That's not interesting or engaging. Part of how we're in relationship with one another is by being open to being surprised by one another and by not always having all of the answers in front of us. Mystery is kind of crucial to deepening relationship. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Jesus teaches in parables, is because he desires to be in relationship with us and we with him. The other reason, the third reason that I think Jesus preaches and teaches in parables is related to the parable of the sower, which is that in the parable of the sower, the thing that some commentators and preachers draw our attention to is the fact that we focus on the seeds in the soil because that is the primary focus of the parable and the focus of Jesus's interpretation, right? That these different soils are these different things, and the word is, But what we don't focus on as much is the fact that the sower is a very terrible farmer. Have y'all heard this interpretation? This, I think, is actually really, really important. And Jesus doesn't draw attention to it, but I think that it is important for our understanding of why Jesus teaches in parables. Why would a farmer throw seeds on ground that he knows is not going to work, right? That's a bad farmer. That, you're not going to do that. It's a waste of the seeds. But that's not the point. The point is actually that the seeds are just thrown everywhere wantonly because God's grace, mercy, and the truth of the gospel is for everyone. It's not meant to be hoarded. It's not meant to be sort of only planted in the places where we know it's going to grow. In fact, actually, Jesus tells another parable about how things grow in secret, and you might not know how. And then all of a sudden they sprout up, right? There's a parable for that. There's a mystery to be explored there. But I think this is also why Jesus teaches in parables, is because the good news of the kingdom of heaven is more mysterious, more wondrous, and more incomprehensible than we could ever hope or imagine, and that we should share that good news as lavishly and as generously as humanly possible. And what happens next, God will take care of, right? So it may not be satisfying all of the time because parables don't tie things off in neat bows. And I think even, again, we could spend some time with Jesus's interpretations here and still wrestle a little bit with some of them. But nevertheless, I think that's the point. One of the things that's always been of great comfort and excitement to me, and I hope will be of great excitement to you in your continued walks with Jesus and discipleship, is that Jesus Jesus didn't even leave us the Gospels. Jesus didn't write those down. Other people had to do it. Jesus didn't write concrete systematized theologies, despite what we have created around the Gospels and Jesus's teachings, which I think are important. Systematic theology is important. But the point is that what Jesus left us was actually mystery and relationship and weird things like the sacraments, things to explore, mysteries that we'll never fully comprehend, at least not this side of things. And I think there's a real grace and beauty in that. Let those who have ears to hear. Amen.
We are a community of believers striving to live out our faith into the world, and this inspiring message, a part of each and every Sunday. You're invited to join us, and to find out more, easy to do. Just go to riversidemccullough.org.